have a lot of information without going into it on things that would be very embarrassing to Vladimir Putin.
We have a P-tape on Putin, is that what you're telling me?
It's not a P-tape.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ian Bremmer, and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast, an audio version of what you can find on public television, where I analyze global topics, sit down with big guests, and make use of small puppets. This week I sit down with Michèle Flournoy, a senior defense official who was asked to work under the Trump administration and said no. Today I'll ask her, why not? Let's get to it.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company. Imagine a bank without teller lines, where your banker knows your name and its most prized currency is extraordinary client service. Hear directly from First Republic's clients by visiting firstrepublic.com.
Michèle Flournoy, managing partner of West Exec Advisors and former Undersecretary of Policy for Defense.
Yes.
Almost Deputy Secretary for Defense, or at least former Secretary Mattis asked you and you declined. Does that look like a good decision these days?
I think so. Yes.
When he left, certainly the conversations around the country were, oh my God, we lost the adult. Now the wheels are going to fall off. You, of course, know the secretary very well. Tell me how you think about it.
Well, I do think that one of the most sort of moderating influences on President Trump was Secretary Mattis when he was in office. There were countless times when the president was about to make a decision that was not in American interests, that Secretary Mattis sort of went over to the White House and sort of talked him through it, put the issue in context, urged him to take a different direction, and convinced him to sort of step back.
Did Mattis feel that he just couldn't be effective anymore? I mean, we know certainly some of the issues they came to a disagreement over, the intervention in Syria, the decision to send troops to the southern border over Thanksgiving. How do you assess that?
I think Jim Mattis has got a great deal of integrity. He's a very principled person, and he takes the oath to the Constitution that he took very seriously. I think his letter actually says it all, his resignation letter. Where he was very clear that he thought that we were heading in the wrong direction, and particularly that we were damaging our alliances. And I think he and many of us view our alliances as a unique source of strategic advantage for the United States. And those were being, very much hurt in a way that was damaging U.S. credibility in the long term. So do you think Mattis misread the president when he first said, I'm going to take this job? Do you think he believed that he could have more influence than he did? Do you think at the end of the day, he just lost patience and said, that's it, enough? I mean, because clearly there is a change in mind that occurs over that trajectory. I think when you have a career military officer take on a role like Secretary of Defense, it's the first time it's happened since George C. Marshall 70 years ago. I think Jim Mattis took the job out of a sense of duty. The other contributing factor here is that after John Bolton took on the National Security Advisor role, basically the NSC process stopped. There are no principals meetings, or very rarely. There are very few, if any, NSC meetings. There's a paper process for sort of signing off on things, but the whole process that's designed to bring a variety of views to a president, including dissent, to help that president make better decisions or more informed decisions, that's broken down. It's not happening. Because of Bolton? I mean, he certainly has the bureaucratic experience. Yeah, but he doesn't see the value in that. I think every national security advisor has two roles. One is to basically be the systems administrator of the interagency process, ensure the president is hearing the views of all of his advisors. The The second is to personally advise the president on national security. Bolton seems to have only taken on the second and disregarded or discounted the first.
What does deterrence of the Russians and separately the Chinese mean to you?
We have to convince Putin that the costs of aggression, military aggression, are so great that he dare not go there. Right now, we see that Russia is certainly not deterred below the level of conventional conflict. They meddled in our elections with virtually no cost. They're meddling in European political systems with virtually no cost. They have, took over Crimea and destabilized Ukraine with minimal cost. So I don't think Vladimir Putin's feeling very deterred at the moment.
And this is true under both administrations.
Yes, it's a problem that started with Obama and continues with Trump. And it's not just a military problem. I mean, deterrence you have to really use effectively all of the instruments of our power.
Well, we do have now more forward deployment for NATO in these countries, including the Baltic states and Poland. But when you talk about deterring the Russians, of course, our experience over the past decade has largely not been about conventional warfare and tanks rolling across borders. It's all this asymmetrical stuff. It's below that. What needs to change?
So I think the heart of any deterrence strategy is really understanding what is the adversary value. And in this system, it is what is Vladimir Putin value. We have a lot of information, without going into it, on things that would be very embarrassing to Vladimir Putin, illicit activities, all kinds of things that he's been involved in over time.
We have a P-tape on Putin, is that what you're talking about?
It's not a P-tape.
Okay.
But I mean, I think there's just a lot of information that could be brought out. I think there are things that we could do in the cyber domain, things that we could do in the an information economic domain that would make it very clear to him, don't go there.
Tell me where you want to spend money on dealing with China right now.
I think one of the mistakes we tend to make is counting shiny objects as the primary metric of our defense.
I know they're building a third aircraft carrier. That is a very shiny object.
So, how many aircraft carriers, 355 ship Navy, how many Air Force squadrons, how many, tanks, et cetera. I am more interested now on, we have a legacy force that we're going to have for decades because we've already made the investment, the capital investment. So the questions in my mind are where are the trade-offs between more quantity versus capability that makes those systems relevant? So, for example, if you take aircraft carriers, we now know that the Chinese have systems that can sink our carriers. We know that they now have air defenses, layered defenses, that would make it very difficult for the aircraft on the carriers to actually reach and penetrate those defenses and actually hold targets at risk. So I'm more interested in saying, at what point do you forgo an extra carrier battle group and take all that money and invest in electronic warfare, the systems that will defeat the Chinese missile that can take down our ships, the munitions that can penetrate those air defenses, the refueling and the other steps that would give us back range, the mixing in unmanned systems, which can both air and undersea, that could give the carrier new relevance. So it's really a question of what are all the capabilities that we have to invest in, the new technologies.
I want to ask you kind of an existential strategic question, which is, when I think about the Cold War, there's an argument to be made that the Americans forced the Soviets to their knees in the arms race because of the spend. Our economy was much bigger than theirs. They weren't able to keep up. Ultimately, Gorbachev had to give it up. The Chinese economy is likely to outstrip the American economy in absolute size in the next decade. As we look ahead to the next 10, 20, 30 years, if that were to continue, if we were to start to see that a Chinese economy is getting much larger than the U.S., the gap is much bigger, at what point does that affect the way you think strategically about what the United States should be trying to do in terms of global defense?
Well, I think it's a huge argument for going back to our alliances. If you take the U.S. alone, you're right. But if you take the U.S. economy and the European economies, or all the NATO and EU countries, Japan, Australia, South Korea, if you were to take the democratic economies and our allies' economies and put them together in the sense of, a set of countries who are trying to work together, shape the Chinese calculus, compete where we need to, then it's a different ballgame. Then you're in a very different position. And that takes a strategy, it takes a serious amount of diplomacy, and it takes embracing, creating high standard trade agreements that actually give us advantages. I mean, one of the biggest strategic mistakes that I think will go down in history is TPP.
Trans-Pacific Partnership. You really didn't like the Americans pulling out of that.
We negotiated a fantastic trade agreement with our allies and partners in Asia that would have raised the standards and allowed us, would have given us tremendous competitive advantage along with our partners vis-a-vis a rising China. And then we walked away from it. The Trump administration walked away from it.
Now, a new American president could rejoin if that person chose to.
Yes. But in the meantime, China has gained some significant advantage because of the perception that the U.S. has pulled back and created a vacuum.
What's the thing that concerns you most today in terms of China's stance and capabilities vis-a-vis the United States?
I think the thing that concerns me most is that they have an authoritarian system where they can strategically invest in the fundamentals that will allow them to compete successfully in the future. STEM education, technology, on and on and on. Whereas we have not got our internal house in order. We are not investing in the education, in educating the people we need. We are not investing in science and technology and research and development. We are not investing in infrastructure. We are not investing in the drivers of our own economic competitiveness long term, especially vis-a-vis China. And then you couple that with their a concerted campaign of intellectual property theft on the part of China. And, we're in a lot of areas where we've always assumed technological advantage. That is fast eroding, if not already shifting to China.
What are the sudden sea changes that are most likely to come in the near-term future from changes in technology on the battlefield?
I think the first, the two we haven't talked about are cyber and space. Mm-hmm. So if you look at Chinese doctrine, their ideal scenario is if it comes to conflict, they launch a series of crippling cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure here and our space architecture that basically prevents the U.S. military from moving, that prevents us from even projecting power into the region. And so it's over before it starts, and they break our will before we even get there. That is their ideal scenario.
We know that because of public discussion of military doctrine in China, because of what they're spending money on. How do we know that?
I think people who read their military journals, do the translations and so forth, I think that it's a scenario that is talked about in military circles in China, both in publicly available materials and otherwise.
Now, given that Chinese critical infrastructure is controlled by, in a sense, a smaller number of vertically integrated, government-controlled and linked organizations, aren't they more vulnerable to those sorts of cyber attacks than the Americans would be?
They have their own vulnerabilities, but actually one of the challenges we have is most of our critical infrastructure is not owned or operated by the government.
Right.
And so we are only as strong as the weakest link. So
they're more hardened in that regard, you're saying?
Well, I'm not sure but it's not a necessarily symmetric thing because we have to project power to get there. They're there and they have their home region. And so if they're invading Taiwan or they're, getting into a conflict with one of our allies or partners in the region, we have to project power to get there. And again, as I said, they're going to try to interrupt that process.
What interests me about this is that historically the way we used to think about the Chinese, right, is when military doctrine is, they could take a hit of a few 100 million people in, sort of a horrible nuclear war, and they'd still be around, and we kind of wouldn't be, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, when you talk about switching that to cyber and space, they're vulnerable. I mean, it's not clear to me that why they would necessarily prefer that as a doctrine.
Well, because of preferring that, it's a matter of, if they were able to do that with minimal actual casualties to the American. I mean, so now you've crippled the American military, but you haven't killed Americans, or hope they hope not to actually. You haven't kinetically struck the American homeland. And so they're trying to avoid the sort of risk of nuclear escalation. It's more a matter of influencing decision and will. If they make it too hard, if they create a fait accompli and they make it too hard for us to respond.
So it's a leveler.
It's almost like can you create enough of a debate internally to say, look, this is, why do we care about Taiwan? Or why do we care about this? Or why do we care about that? Maybe we should just stop. This is too hard.
Michèle Flournoy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's our show this week. We'll be right back here next week, same place, same time, unless you're watching on social media, in which case it's wherever you happen to be. Don't miss it. In the meantime, check us out at gzeromedia.com.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company. Imagine a bank without teller lines, where your banker knows your name and its most prized currency is extraordinary client service. Hear directly from First Republic's clients by visiting firstrepublic.com.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.